Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's 1:01 and we have a lot of awesome info and interactivity in this post-lunch session to make our way through. Good afternoon, I am Jen Dindinger. I'm a watershed restoration specialist with University of Maryland Sea Grant Extension, and I am one of the planners on the planning team for the Watershed Forum, so welcome. I don't know about you, but it's super rainy here in Easton, so I'm kind of glad we're not trekking around NCTC in this weather. I just have a few housekeeping notes before we get started, which you can also see on the screen. The session is being recorded. If you do not want to have your face on the recording, please feel free to shut your camera off. The recording will be made available in a couple of days. Because this is a meeting and not a webinar, you do have the opportunity to change your name. So we ask that if you're comfortable, please rename to your name, your preferred pronouns, and your organization. If you have any technical difficulties, you can send me or Ola Davis a message in the chat, and we will do our best to help you. And the rest of the forum schedule can be found on the SCED website, which I will put into the chat when we're done here. I am going to ask that you reserve the chat box for questions for our presenters, and we're going to see where we can slot those in. And if you want to chat with each other, to do that separately. So I'm going to turn it over to our two amazing speakers. We have Bre'Anna Brooks, who is from the Chesapeake Bay Trust, and Mariah Davis from the Choose Clean Water Coalition. And I also wanted to thank Ola Davis from the Alliance for the Chesapeake, who is our tech leader in the background. So take it away, Bre'Anna and Mariah.
All right, you can click the next slide. And hey, everybody, my preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm Mariah Davis. I'm the Policy and Campaigns Manager for the Choose Clean Water Coalition. We're a coalition of 250 environmental nonprofits working within the Chesapeake Bay Watershed to restore our healthy rivers and streams. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk with you in this discussion.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing to be with us. We very much appreciate it. My name is Bre'Anna Brooks. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am a program officer at the Chesapeake Bay Trust. I work on the outreach and education team. The Trust is a nonprofit grant-making organization we're dedicated to protecting and restoring the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as, every little kind of nook and cranny of our region. I also manage our diversity and inclusion committees at the Trust. All right, so we're going to jump into what we're talking about today. So here's our agenda. We'll go over the process, outcomes, and purpose. Why are we even talking about this? What are we going to talk about today? And of course, we'll go over community agreements, just shared agreements that we can agree with moving forward for the rest of our time together. We'll do a little self-check-in. We want to see how everyone is doing today. And then we'll do a brief overview of the DEIJ in Action Guide, or Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice in Action Guide. Many of you have heard of it, many of you are using it, so we'll just do a brief overview of that. And then we'll really jump into the meat of our conversation around organizational culture, as well as bringing your leadership along. So a lot of this kind of internal work or internal framework. We can move forward.
All right, so we'll just quickly go over some shared agreements that I hope we can use these to kind of set the expectation and the tone of this session. We want to make sure that this is a welcoming and inclusive space for all of us and all of our various ideas. And Jen has just shared them in the chat, so we can continue to refer to these throughout our conversation. The first one being listening to understand and respond with curiosity. That basically just means being an active listener and being open to listening and responding to any new information that you might be. Being present, being open, and being authentic. So bringing the best version of yourselves to this conversation. Respect confidentiality. We might bring up some hard or difficult conversations, and we want to make sure that what stays here and is learned here stays here in this space. Respecting our diversity. We have a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds and how we come to this space in our own DEIJ journey. So we want to make sure that we're respecting the multiple perspectives and a range of diversity that we do have in this conversation. Move up, This basically means, if you're somebody who's typically shy, you might stay in the background a bit. We want you to move up. We want you to engage and be present, and just, be engaging in the conversation if you're used to being in the background. And then always continue to look for learning throughout this conversation. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Mariah. Of course, this is only a short list of agreements. If anyone has any that you want to add, feel free to add it to the chat. They're shared agreements. So certainly we want to co-create these agreements. It's really how they're best done. So feel free to drop anything in the chat now or as the session goes on. All right, so our purpose. Let's discuss kind of the broader purpose to ground us a little bit. So one, if you haven't already, please visit the guide, as we'll refer to it, the DEIJ in Action Guide, for term definitions. This is found on page 6. I believe Jen will go ahead and drop that in the chat shortly, and it's on page 6. So shared language is super important. We're not going to define them today. We're not going to verbalize that, but we do welcome you to navigate your way to find the definitions of the words that we'll be using today frequently. So a quick, brief overview of the guide. I'm going to talk about it a little bit in a minute, but I do just want to say that the Chesapeake Bay Trust, Choose Clean Water Coalition, and the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network all collaborated on a first-of-its-kind assessment of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and used the data from that assessment to inform the guide itself. So grounding us, what is the impetus? We know from Green 2.0 findings in 2014 that the environmental field has several challenges related to racial diversity. Some examples are unconscious bias, issues with retention. There's the green ceiling where organizations do not, go past 16% of people of color. So that's kind of more broad, right? But if we focused in regionally, based on the outcomes of the readiness assessment that I just mentioned, we know that our organizations value DEIJ, something like 97%. But many organizations are not operationalizing DEIJ, right? So putting it into action. So our purpose is, and for promoting and utilizing the guide, is to chart a path forward on really integrating DEIJ into the fabric of our organizations within this region. And for today, our kind of session purpose, really why we're talking about this is from the report itself, we learned that you all, your organizations, you have a need and interest in increasing internal diversity of underrepresented groups and your DEIJ capacity at all levels of the organization. That is why we are here today. And we'll move forward on what you will walk away with. So we hope that folks, through our instruction, we're going to have a mix of instruction and interaction, both with self and others during the session. We hope that you'll walk away with increased knowledge of ways of recognizing existing culture, your organizational culture, that is, and then ways to begin to shift that culture. A greater understanding of mechanisms to bring leadership along to advancing DEIJ efforts that includes that organizational culture aspect. And then, we'll be presenting kind of a slew of tools and resources for you all to consider for operationalizing DEIJ. So just a couple things really quickly. We have a fun and informational filled session, and we'll be using every second of our time together. So definitely ask clarifying questions along the way, but if you kind of have any content related questions, feel free to ask that at the end. We have dedicated time for that. And I think that's it. We can move forward, Ola.
All right, so I just want to quickly point to this resource, and I think Jen might have actually dropped our slide presentation into the chat. But this is a shared parking lot of resources that we want you to be able to use and share any resources that you have that you think are relevant to this conversation. Bre'Anna and I have started to include some in here around culture, to include the guide and even a guide around dismantling racism and white supremacy within your organizations. But if you're going through the motions and you're like, hey, I think this would be really great for everybody to see, we want you to make sure to parking lot your materials here, and we can refer back to those later. You can move to the next slide, Ola. All right, so here's a fun one, a fun interactive activity. We just want to know how you're feeling today. I hope you're feeling energized, but it's okay if you're feeling like a 1 through an 8. So I'm definitely feeling like a 1 and an 8. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat, but we want to encourage everybody here to tell us how you're feeling. So feel free to kind of take a look at these. I'd say number 1 is really excited. Number 2 is kind of like a getting over hump day. It's almost Friday. I'm kind of feeling like that too. Number 3, grumpy cat. Number 4, kind of frazzled. 5, kind of sleepy koala bear. 6, in the mood for a drink, almost Friday. Number 7, excited. And number 8 looks like he's drunk in love or something like that, Beyonce reference, but looks like we've got some 4s, some 3s. Oh yeah, the rain's getting to me too. Some 7s, some 8s. Good. This is a really good exercise for us to engage, how everybody's feeling. We hope by the end of this, you're feeling like a number 7 and you're really energized to go change your organizational culture. You can, I'll wait till everybody puts in how they're feeling. Yeah.
This is great. I think it really does show that we're all at different places, right? In many different respects. Thank you all for being here, especially if you're feeling like a 5, if you're feeling like a 3. Thanks for pulling through. Awesome. All right. Great. So let's talk about the guide. Again, I won't spend too much time here. This is actually my 3rd time presenting at the Watershed Forum on the guide itself. So this, and Mariah and I've presented in the past before on it too. So this is more kind of like a step 2, so we won't do a deep dive on the guide itself. So really quickly, in May 2017, as I mentioned before, the Chesapeake Bay Trust, the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network, and Choose Clean Water Coalition, as supported through the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network Capacity Building Initiative, launched a significant collaborative initiative to assess the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion among organizations working on environmental issues in our watershed, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The findings gleaned from this assessment they are accessible, they can be found in the appendix. So if you access the link in the chat as it relates to the additional resources on the Trust website, you can find the appendix there. So the findings gleaned from this assessment, along with an EJ listening session, environmental justice listening session, informed the development of the DEIJ in Action Guide, which provides recommendations and strategies for organizations on how they can increase DEIJ within their organizations, and then also the funders that support the environmental organizations. So this effort represented a first assessment of its kind within our region, and really the impetus for launching this initiative grew out of several DEIJ efforts already being led by the 3 organizations previously mentioned. So the guide is a tool for planning and tracking organizational progress. So really great. We provide a kind of a chart in the back. It's kind of almost like a step-by-step where you can look at all of the recommendations and strategies at once and really pinpoint where you feel like you are ready to start, and then you can track as you go along. The guide is version 1, so we definitely see the guide as a working document, and we plan to update the guide as time goes on, as we learn more and as we enhance the guide itself. The guide is not a one-size-fits-all or how-to manual. So certainly, it's not a chronological list of recommendations. We do hope that folks pursue the resources that are embedded within the guide itself. It's not going to kind of walk you through how to put up your quarantine office desk, right? Like you're going to kind of pop all over the place depending on what is more appropriate for your organization. And it's certainly not flawless. So we hope to gather your feedback as you integrate this into your DEIJ plan. We want to learn from how your organizations are doing with the guide. And I think that I'll stop there. We can go ahead and move forward.
All right. So chapter 3 of the guide focuses a lot on transforming your internal organizational culture. There's some really great tips and tricks in there on how to do that and some best practices. But this slide is here for you today just to talk and summarize a bit about how culture actually appears and shows up in the workplace. So in the first bullet, you'll see that culture can really show up in our behaviors. So how are we treating each other in our workplace? The language that we use, our communication style. How are we talking to each other? What's the type of language that we're using? Through our social norms, through our office norms, and through our values. Culture shows up in so many different ways. When I think about the Chesapeake community and this community that we're in, we use a ton of acronyms and how we speak and talk to each other. We also, we might dress a certain way. If we were at the Watershed Forum, I think we'd all be encouraged to be in comfy kind of clothes. And I think we can all agree that we love the outdoors. So that's just, a small snippet of how organizational culture can show up in our organizations. And we'll go into greater detail about that. But that's just to give you some things to be thinking about throughout this training. It's not a one size fits all. If you go into a Starbucks, you go into a Target, you come into one of our organizations, the culture at each of those places is going to show up and appear very differently. So it's not a one size fits all. Even between environmental organizations and different places that you go, it's going to look very differently in our behaviors, our language, our communication style, and so on. It is something that is co-created and upheld within the organization. I think one thing I've always thought was really important is that when you are a leader at the organization, you set the tone, and you are somebody who has the ability to set the culture at your organization. You might see, sometimes, or might have seen in your past experiences, if you get a new director or a new staff person or a new board chair, somebody who's in power, they can really create a big shift in the tone and within the organizational culture. Organizational culture is rooted in organizational values, and it is something that evolves over time. Throughout this session, if you are somebody who wants to continue to ingrain DEIJ in everything that you do, we want you to know that it is something that you can put a lens on, and you can put it and create it into your organizational values. And it's something that can continue to evolve and grow over time. So that's organizational culture in a nutshell. Go on to the next slide.
All right, so we've got a fun little video for everyone to watch. This is one example of how organizational culture can be considered alienating to people, kind of new or already in the organization with new or different identities. So I just want to preface this before everyone watches it, that what we don't want you to take away is that this is a male versus a female thing, and really that the ball of yarn here can be representative of any identity that could be alienating to a group. So the short shows how culture can show up and how it can show up, how it can be intentional or unintentional. And then following the video, we will share out with each other where we feel culture showed up and what it looked like. So you all should go ahead and access the slides, the Google Slides now if you haven't already. And on slide 13 and 14, this is where we will be interacting together to type into the sticky notes how we feel culture showed up. So the directive is to click on the link. Jen is going to drop it in the chat for us to watch. We can't watch it together because of bandwidth and connection stuff. So we're going to have you all go separately watching the video, and then we will come back. Let's see here. It is almost 1:20. So let's come back. It's about a 9-minute video. So let's come back at 1:29.
All right, everybody. So it's 1:29. You might just be coming back in from your video, which we hope you enjoyed. Please refer to the Google Slides that we've shared in the chat, and you can type in on slides 13 and 14 your takeaways about how culture showed up the video. It looks like many of you are typing away, which we love to see. So we'll give everybody a couple of minutes to just utilize the slides and type in how culture showed up. So I'm just going to start to read some of these as you're typing away to summarize the video of how culture showed up. Somebody actually typed in the chat through the dress and style of banter. Yeah. Yeah, definitely wearing a lot of suits, and Pearl had throughout the video sort of changed, her behavior and how she dressed. Very emotional, communic, ostracizing people not like them. The group bonded over alcohol. Yeah, that's definitely a way that culture can show up within an organization. Strong sense of humor, racially and gender homogenous. Yep. There was a need to be assertive, toxic. Who went to lunch and where? Communication style. Wow, yeah. So this is a really great summary, that I'm seeing, as far as your takeaways from the video. Is there anybody who would like to unmute themselves and share an observation about culture that they saw that stuck out to them very strongly?
We'd love to hear from anybody. If you're willing to share just kind of generally what you saw, what you noticed. I might have to randomly call on somebody.
If I could chime in, something that I noticed was everyone benefits from inclusion, even people that on the surface appear to be a part of the originally accepted group. In the end, you notice that some of the original guys were dressing differently or acting differently than they had been at the beginning. So there's kind of like that underneath level of inclusion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that absolutely does. I thank you for mentioning that. And I think that you're right. It shows how there can be a greater change in not only the people, but the organization. They kind of try and show that projections are up and, they're more productive just kind of through this short video. But I think that it does represent something larger. Thank you for sharing. Also, thank you folks who are, in the chat. We welcome that. All right, cool. Thanks all so much. I think we're going to push forward. And let's keep talking about culture here. So we'll go forward to slide 15. What is important to recognize about culture? So one, culture and inclusion are dynamic. They are ever shifting and just kind of constantly needing to be reevaluated because of change. So when a new person joins staff, it's possible that the culture may actually alter to allow that person to feel included. Far too often, people think that that you have to bring in people into your existing culture, subsequently ignoring what makes them feel comfortable. So for example, expecting people to adapt or adjust to existing culture is integration, not inclusion. Shifts in culture take time. Denver Foundation said, perhaps more than any other elements of creating an inclusive organization, changing organizational culture takes time. It is not a linear process that happens overnight. And in fact, changes to organizational climate can be chaotic. So it's important to note here that while you can and should develop deliberate strategies to improve organizational culture, some changes will naturally occur as a byproduct of other activities on your DEIJ journey. So no one of these changes really makes a big headline, but in total, they account for much of an increased productivity and overall feelings of inclusion. And finally, let's recognize the importance of value of measuring your efforts. So help demonstrate the effectiveness of your efforts in shifting culture by implementing employee surveys and analyzing gaps between desired and actual behavior. So, consistent anonymous feedback loops are a really great example here. So really quickly, I want to talk about this graphic. The iceberg graphic depicts what is visible in terms of organizational culture, what is outwardly facing, and what is invisible of an organization. So that piece under the water is the organization's DNA or company DNA, as it's kind of termed or coined. It's shorthand for an organizational culture and strategy. It's really just a metaphor of what makes the organization unique. And so many of these cultural factors are above the surface, but really majority of the mass is below the surface, similar to the anatomy of an iceberg. Okay, we can push forward.
All right, well, studies show that overall investing in positive organizational work cultures and workplaces is going to help to improve staff performance, your own performance, effectiveness, and efficiency. You're going to get a greater return on investment. So there's a lot that organizations might be losing when they're not investing in their people. Here's just a few things that Bre'Anna and I have summarized that we feel that when you are able to organize or align, we feel that building a culture that aligns with people and organizational values, you're going to be able to get those types of returns. So the first one being investing in your teams, invest in their professional development, invest in their short and long-term goals, give them leadership opportunities and responsibilities. This is something that's greatly benefited me in my professional journey. And I think it's just something that I will always continue to hammer when it comes to building those really positive workplace cultures. Establishing work connections in the workplace, encourage connections, those being workplace relationships at every level. It helps to build trust and open communication, celebrate those small wins, and continue to recognize and encourage everybody at every level. I think this is especially important when it comes to people at organizations who might have marginalized identities, who might be dealing with maybe unforeseen barriers and things like that. This is a really great place, a really great way to build trust and open communication by establishing those work connections in your workplace. Connecting roles to purpose. Develop a culture that leverages your employees' strengths and reinforces their role and the important role that they have within that organization. Again, these are just a few things that we feel are going to go a long way when you really start to invest in the people and the organization values and align those things. I think that they're always going to work to create a healthy and encouraging environment. If there's other resources out there that you feel that are in alignment with these, please share those in the parking lot. But these are just a few things. You can go to the next slide. Okay, and this is just one quick resource I'd like to share. Ola, if you're able to click on the link here, this is a tool that we've created at the Choose Clean Water Coalition. You can click on the first one. Bre'Anna had mentioned anonymous feedback loops. We've been able to put together an organizational step-by-step guide that can show you how to solicit feedback and for you to assess your organizational culture at your organization so that you can create a shift. So if you scroll down, Ola, you'll see that there's some sample questions in here that you can use to ask, survey your organization, come up with an entire report on a culture audit. If you scroll all the way down, Ola, you'll see sample questions that we have here and an example of how to create a report with different findings and ways that you can understand maybe some barriers that your organization might need to address in their culture. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to me. This is just a resource that we wanted to point to as a tool and a resource to improve your organizational culture.
Great, and I will show, just share one quick example. Certainly if folks have questions about either of these, feel free to reach out to both Mariah and I, since we're limited on time here. But I just wanted to describe a recent development in the trust realm of what we're doing to recognize existing culture and work to shift so all are included. So we created an organization culture committee. And the goal is to ensure that the trust values permeate through our daily work experience, making work more meaningful, giving a sense of belonging to staff and really helping staff feel fulfilled in their day-to-day work. And so an organizational culture committee can help an organization to further operationalize their existing values by using kind of that stuff, that we saw in the iceberg, kind of the invisible things. So we'll move forward, but certainly reach out to us if you have any questions about these two examples. All right, so, we've talked about what culture is, where does it show up, what's it look like, what are things important to recognize, let's talk about what if we just don't do anything or if we just kind of stay with the status quo. So I pulled this recent interview with the new executive director for Green 2.0, Andres, And he made some really important statements that I think are important to share here. So he says, I think that organizations really need to look at who they are and their mission. They need to look at an actual cultural change. If they don't change from the foundation of who they are, if they don't change culturally, then they will continue to run into the problems. That is, even if they do bring in people of color, and if they don't make them feel like they're a part of the team, if they don't feel like they belong, they will leave. And that's where we get into the retention issue that we saw back in 2014, as discovered, as a national issue as it relates to the environmental field. So just, kind of what I want to point out here is that if organizations hold the belief or make statements that kind of this is how things have always been, it really feeds into the resistance to change phenomenon. This is the way things have always been. It's one of the most common phrases used during change. And in fact, it's completely normal to have strong convictions when something has been done a certain way for a long time, and it's worked. So the question is, what is needed as a foundation for change? And as we're going to transition into our next kind of portion of the session, is leadership. So I will just kind of pause here really quickly. We maybe have a few seconds to a minute for any questions that are coming up as it relates to organizational culture as we transition into bringing your leadership along.
Bre'Anna and Mariah, I just wanted to point to a couple of the great comments I'm seeing in the chat about the difficulty that Pearl had trying to decide whether to stick with her new group or to remind herself of who she was and reach out to the new person coming in. So I just thought there were some good points coming through the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, for pointing that out. That's absolutely great stuff that you all are notifying. She did try to assimilate, but she kind of found her voice and found what happens when she is her true self, that others can also be their true selves, acting as an example, which is a great segue into our next topic here, really around leadership and kind of the role that they can play in this work. So we can advance forward. All right, so we've got a kind of a series of titles here for you around bringing your leadership along. And of course, we're going to start with, why is this important? So along with what you may be asking, DEIJ efforts, that include culture shifts, inclusion initiatives, internal work of increasing knowledge of, environmental justice, for example, and so on. So kind of the root of why this is important should be related back to your organization's mission. And if we are engaging different levels of the organization, everyone can, help advance the organization's mission. Reaching those with decision-making power. So the analogy that I kind of like to use here is when we're thinking of, maybe behavior change with students, kind of, folks that are under 18, they're kind of locus of power or change is a little bit limited just because of, their age and their lack of, having a job and money, as an example. So when we're talking about an organization, we really want to make sure that those folks with decision-making power are, along with this conversation, so that we can actually really see those changes. And I do just want to kind of pause there and, of course, recognize that folks not at the leadership level are making great changes, and they're really leading from where they are, which is super important to recognize, and definitely has its power in its own right. Leadership can play an important role. Oh, sorry, still going. Leadership can play an important role as leaders to lower level staff. So we know that they kind of what we saw in Pearl, she was kind of a leader in her own right, and that she helped others to be themselves. But certainly our supervisors and executive level can play an important role to lower level staff. And then just a quick little kind of tidbit of data here that we got from the assessment was that lower level staff feel differently than senior level staff. So generally speaking, we found that lower level and younger staff think that we have more to do in the space of DEIJ compared to more senior people, both in age and role. So we do realize that this is, data from 2017, but I think that despite this kind of gap in time, that this data is still prevalent today. All right, we can advance forward.
All right, so we've talked a lot about what is culture, how does it show up? Now we're going to shift and talk a bit about how to bring your leadership along, create that transformational change from within. So here's a little taste of how to do it. I think one of the first and most important things that you can do to create that organizational shift is to identify a champion who can become an advocate, whether that's somebody that you work alongside in your organization who might have influence, whether that's a staff person who is really inspired to do the work and has a really great story to share, or whether that's somebody on your board and somebody that you know supports this work. So it's really important to always look and identify those champions and those people who are going to advocate for that change. And sometimes you might be in a place where it doesn't exist. So also just recognize that you can be the advocate, you can be that champion, and it can always start with you as well. Tie it to your mission statement and your values. I think that's really, really important when it comes to presenting this to people who are at the board level or in higher levels of position, is to always tie this back to your mission and to your values. Bre'Anna and I are going to do some fun exercises and breakouts on how exactly you can do that, but I think that's really critical in how to create that transformational change and move along. Build off of shared experiences and knowledge. There's a ton of different spaces that you can go and attend that Bre'Anna and I are involved in to get and learn more shared knowledge around this, but always try to build off of those shared experiences and knowledges and resources when you can. Create commitment, develop goals, and integrate them into staff work plans. We've talked a bit about that. I think that's really important and a really critical piece, and how to operationalize DEIJ and create that cultural change. Invest in leadership trainings. There's a wide variety out there. If you're ever interested in knowing or looking for places to find trainings around this, I share them all of the time. So please contact me, but they are definitely out there. And timing matters. So if you find that you're in a place where you're kind of hitting a roadblock, change your leadership. But these are just a few tips and tricks and things that you can do. But you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, Ola. And we're going to talk a little bit about ways in which we can actually create that transformational change. So Francisco Paco Olivares, he did a really great training with CBT and some of their grantees on bringing leadership along. And there's several different ways that you can do this through verbiage and making the case. You can do this strategically, you can do this empirically, and you can do this ethically. So I'm going to run through some examples of what that means and how to be able to verbalize and make the case to whoever it is that you want to bring along, by connecting it back to your mission and back to your values. So the first way you can do that is strategically, by verbally making the case strategically. So you can do this in a way that relates to the achievement of your long-term goals and outcomes and interests. This is something that I do all of the time. And here's an example that I use a lot, when it comes to why I think we need to compartmentalize DEIJ and create organizational change. You could say to your leadership, for example, in order to meet the diversity goals laid out in the TMDL by 2025, we must incorporate DEIJ in everything that we do. A lot of our advocacy groups have really worked to make that strategic sort of change. So definitely go to that, and that's something that you can use as it relates to creating the long-term change and achievement strategically. Empirically, you can also work to make the case by a means of observation and experience rather than pure theory or logic. So an example of how you can do that empirically by using other people's experiences and making it known that this is a real thing, this is a real phenomenon. You could say something like, there's empirical evidence that people of color often feel unsafe in the outdoors. It's time we unpack and dismantle systems of oppression that deny people equal access into the outdoors. You all have seen in the news about people trying to have barbecues in public parks and getting kicked out, or birders being in the park and being verbally harassed. This happens all the time. So there's ways that you can make the case to bring your leaders along by a means of shared experiences and referring back to those, especially when they occur in the moment. You can also do this ethically. You can do it in a way that relates to your moral principles. So one example that I love that actually came from Drew Robinson, he's on our staff. You can use this as an example. You can say our mission strives to preserve healthy habitats and biodiversity in nature. In the same way, we need diversity within our organizations to thrive and in some cases survive. So these are just a few ways and tactics that you can use to make the case. Again, it's strategically, empirically, and ethically. We'll continue to refer to these throughout the rest of the session. You can advance to the next slide.
All right, so now it's time for the breakouts. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I'm super excited to have everyone kind of get loose and talk with each other. So the instructions here are to create statements, just as we saw from Mariah's examples, that use the angle of the dimension to which you are assigned. You will know which dimension you have when you get placed into a breakout room. It will show up on your screen, so just pay attention to that. And you'll work with your group to create statements. You're going to actually create a few. Certainly pull from existing statements that, if your organization already has one. A lot of what we're doing here is a shared vision in terms of, charting a path for DEIJ and the watershed. So we should be learning from each other. So you're going to use the next 10 minutes to create multiple statements. You will use the Google Slides that we have, the links that we've provided to you, and you'll look slides 23 through about 34. You'll find your group number, the dimension in which you are focusing on, and you're going to actually type in there. The value of this is that everyone can access this today, tomorrow, whenever, and we can all just kind of learn from each other moving forward. After the breakout, we will come together and we will look at slide 35 and 36. You're going to pick your top winner statement and we're going to share it out with the entire group. All right, wonderful. So if you haven't started already, go ahead and go to slide 35 and 36 and drop in your favorite statement that you all made, or kind of the one that rises to the top. You'll see your group number on the little purple sticky note. We'll give everyone about maybe 20 seconds to copy and paste and format. It looks like maybe some of the formatting's a little wonky, but that's okay. We'll roll with it.
Do you know how I can get to that slideshow again?
Yeah, we can drop it in the chat for you.
Thank you.
And if it's easier, y'all, feel free to drop it in the chat. Like if you want to drop in your statement in the chat, we're here to make our lives easier and not more complicated. Absolutely. And maybe, Ola, if we can share slide 35 to start. And let's go ahead and have group 3 share out their statement. They were the empirical group. Anybody from that group want to speak out?
I can speak, and I'm going to take the first one, which Mariah so kindly typed for us. So I think I'm cheating a little bit, but we were talking a lot about making sure that the staff and the board and volunteers, so basically everybody involved with the organization, is representative of the community and the people that they are serving. And that was kind of the main overarching conversation.
Great, thank you, Maya, for sharing. Let's have someone from ethical group share, maybe group number. Let's go to the next slide, Ola, please. Cool, group number 4. You're on. Anybody from group number 4 want to share? If not, we can push forward.
So group number 4, we had a fact. It says, we know that DNR tickets Latinx individuals at a rate of 80 to 90%. And so we must make it a priority to stand by Latinx fishers as allies and use our partnerships with government agencies to advocate for changes to the license application process with Latino community members in mind.
Great, this is wonderful, right? So empirical, you pulled data. So that's where we saw kind of the empirical side of it show up in this statement. That's wonderful, thank you. Okay, let's hear from strategic, and I think this will be the last one just for the interest of time. Go to anyone, Ola, you get to choose the next strategic that we show up on. keep going. Have we done ethical? Maybe not. Yes, we have. Okay. So Ola, if you can just maybe go to slide 35, the sticky notes. This works too. Group number 2, you're on.
I can go ahead and share for our group. We had a couple like broader things that we talked about as well, but I think one of the good ones that we talked about was board representation that mirrors the community. And I think strategically just, remembering that we can reach out to other groups that have local partnerships or that maybe have connections to groups that we haven't thought of, and showing that that has value for our organizations is really important. And then the last thing for our group was just being cognizant that, by engaging with one underrepresented group, we can't forget about all of the other underrepresented groups. And so we need to work to bring in all voices to prove that, there are voices and there are needs that maybe not everybody thinks about. So, yeah.
Thanks, Joe, for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, he's speaking to the intersectionality, right, that we often see with people. Thank you, everyone, for your additions. Ola, if you could go ahead and go all the way to the end. We're going to go to slide 35. Okay, so the point that I want to make here with the very limited time that I have is each and every one of these dimensions has value, and if you're not using all of them in kind of your one case statement, you may miss folks, right? So it's important to mesh together these dimensions in your statement to really bring along kind of the different types of people that respond, in a different way. Some folks are more data driven, some more kind of think in kind of like the ethics mind frame. So I hope that we can all learn from each other in this exercise. These slides are yours to access. So feel free to use this, whether it's the resources or what your colleagues have shared, moving forward. Okay, if you can go forward to slide 37. This is kind of a little bit of what I just mentioned, carrying it out. I did want to mention mechanisms. I told you all that might be something you walk away with. So, we have the verbiage, we have the statement, but how do you go ahead and use that? With what mechanism do you put that forward? So here's a few examples, presenting it in front of a committee or your board committee, or maybe even utilizing a third party contractor to assist in crafting the verbiage and then helping you to make that case. And really quickly, what does it look like daily? We're assigning clear roles. Every person of the organization should be involved in DEIJ work because, there's every single part of every department, every fabric of our organization can really help to push forward the mission. And with that, I'm going to move forward. Here is our contact information. If anyone has questions after this session, if you, want to chat more, Mariah and I are available. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. And with that, we can go ahead and take questions. Feel free to put it in the chat or come off mute. We definitely love to hear from people directly.
Great, thank you both. We have about 5 minutes left for questions till the formal end of the session. I want to just remind everyone that the next session starts at 2:30, and that would be office hours if you signed up for them. We'll put the link to the sked.com website in the chat again. And if you would please go to that link and provide feedback for this session. I know that Mariah and Bre'Anna would love to hear your thoughts. So as they said, please drop a question in the chat or just unmute. Looks like we have only 28 folks, so it should be pretty easy. I guess I have a question. I'll try to seed the discussion. What kind of responses are you both seeing in your own organizations? Not to throw anyone under the bus, but what kinds of responses have you seen in your organization and maybe things you didn't anticipate coming up while implementing this work?
I have one to share. I ended up, the resource that I shared about the culture audit, I did with our office of about 15 to 20 individuals. And we actually have an award called like a SLAP award. And it's an award that we use to share individual successes. And we didn't know or realize that not everybody within our organization was getting equal recognition through that award. One of the other things that we've been able to discover with our culture audit, that we conducted the culture audit kind of while we were in person and then through COVID transition, but there's more, we need more attentiveness when it comes to being more inclusive with our remote employees. So those are just a few things that we've been able to discover in doing this transformational work over the last couple of months and implementing some steps to fix those barriers.
That's great. Thank you.
What I'll add here is the Trust, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee, which is an external committee of about 14 folks within the community. We've grown the board representation from 1 person to 4, which is just really exciting stuff over the years. So we're identifying champions, right? So we're not putting all the work on kind of one person, but we have kind of power in the number of voices at the board level.
That's great. I think that really speaks to your earlier slide talking about leadership feeling different from the way folks on the ground work. I see there's a great question from Melissa in the chat. How do you work with people who may be resistant to having these conversations? Slowly, I guess.
I think just going back to the strategically and empirically and ethically, there's all sorts of ways that people learn and come to receive this information, like light bulb moments, but sometimes it's watching a video or being with you and experiencing something that they've never experienced before. There's different moments that people like start to kind of learn and understand, but I think the more exposure that people get over time to these conversations so that they continue to understand, it's not easy, it is a journey, it's information that you just have to, keep going and keep going and keep going. I guess I don't have the, the best way in explaining that, but I think it's increased in exposure over time.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, in ways that maybe are a little bit strategic to, right, increasing our knowledge of some of these things may also kind of, increase our interest and recognize the importance of it. So one example from the trust end, it was a recommendation that came out of the guide actually that we kind of enhanced to fit our organization is we're going to do an environmental justice book club, right? So at all levels, we're kind of learning together and, hoping to invite kind of the near community to continue to learn and hopefully that maybe you really start at square one and, doing the kind of learning phase. But Melissa, that's a great question. I think that we could talk for days about that.
Organizations like the Alliance has plenty of educational opportunities. Our coalition, Choose Clean Water Coalition, we have a ton of educational and continued learning opportunities. So if you're ever interested in, pointing, those people in those directions, feel free to contact me.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the planning team. Really, really appreciate all the work that both of you put into making this presentation and adapting to COVID times. Super shout out to Ola. She has been a machine in the background, moving all the slides, navigating everything. Thank you all. I think that Bre'Anna and Mariah have a few extra minutes to hang out, but folks can go now. And please don't forget to provide a review of the session on the sched.com website.